couple of weeks, Hanukkah is coming up. So before we get to the parish, I'd like to talk just a drop about Hanukkah. The fundamental issue about which the whole Hanukkah story revolves is the question of Hellenism. What is Hellenism? It's important to make a distinction between what is called Hellenic culture and Hellenist culture. The two don't mean the same thing. Hellenic culture, of course, Hellas was the name of ancient Greece. Hellenic culture is the pure, unadulterated culture of ancient Greece, with its art and drama and sport and religion, democracy in Athens, militarism in Sparta. The pure Greek culture is called Hellenic culture. When Alexander the Great of Macedonia became the conqueror of the entire Greek peninsula and spread his empire eastward, so his armies carried along with them culture, Greek culture, but it was Greek culture which adapted itself and blended with the local cultures of the places they conquered. So it wasn't pure Greek culture anymore. It was a blend. In Persia, it was a blend of Persian culture and Greek culture. In Egypt, it was a blend of Egyptian culture and Greek culture. So it wasn't Hellenic, it was Hellenist. Hellenist is the blend of Greek culture into the local indigenous culture. And this is really why, interestingly, most of the areas which Alexander the Great conquered were fairly cooperative. They didn't put up a lot of resistance because they weren't being overwhelmed. The conquerors weren't saying that you have to shut down your own temples and stop eating the foods that you're comfortable with and live like us. No, there were great accommodations that were made for the local cultures. It was considered like an improvement, as Alexander the Great was bringing with him libraries and theaters and sports arenas, and at the same time we're able to maintain our old practices, our old culture, our old religion. So we have the best of both worlds. So there was no resistance virtually anywhere to Alexander the Great's ideas and his army's ideas. One little place. There was one little place in the world where there was opposition, and that was in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, and even there, it was not among the entire population. There was a very, very significant element, maybe even a majority, of Hellenist Jews who thought this is fine. Because we'll have our Judaism, and we'll have Hellenism too. We'll have a blend. We'll have the best of both worlds. We'll have our cake and eat it too. There was a small number of Jews who said no, that we are not going to allow the blending of Greek culture into Jewish culture. Jewish culture has to remain pure, unadulterated, undiluted, and we're going to resist this. And this was so shocking and so antagonized the various Hellenist kings that it became a battle, it became a war. And of course, those few righteous Jews were victorious in this war, and that's the holiday of Hanukkah that we celebrate. But it's interesting, people that have written the blow by blow of the Hanukkah story point out that the Hanukkah story is not only a battle between the Jews and the Syrian Greek Hellenists, it's also a battle among Jews. And the question, of course, we'll have to ask ourselves, which I'm not going to discuss tonight, is that had we been there, whose side would we be on? I think a lot of the people that celebrate Hanukkah would have been on the wrong side of the battle. They would have been on the Hellenist side. But as the story recedes back into the faded annals of history, so we tend to forget exactly what the issues were. So we tend to think that we would have been on the winning side, and therefore, accordingly, we celebrate. And why not? Because what is our celebration after all? A little dreidel, a little latkes, a little sufganiyot, nothing wrong with that. So we can celebrate, but really, when we analyze the issues, we see they're not so simple at all. So I want to share with you a very, very interesting Ramban in Chumash, in Parshas Ekev, which I think sheds some light on this fundamental issue of when do we allow the blending of foreign culture into Judaism, when do we not allow it? Because the subject is really more complex than even our analysis indicates. The verse says like this, it says, Hisham Malacha, be very careful, when you enter the land of Israel, and you see the nations which I will vanquish, so says God, the nations I will conquer for you, be very careful lest you see their idolatrous practices, and you will ask, you'll inquire, Eicha Yavdu Hagayim Ha'elas Elohayim, how do these nations worship their gods? Ve'es Kain Gamoni, and I'll do the same thing. So, in other words, you have these nations that you're going to conquer, you're going to defeat, you're going to decimate, and as you are contemplating the ruins of their society, you're going to say, let me investigate, how do these people worship their gods, and I will do the same thing. So the question all the commentators ask is, that doesn't follow. These nations were conquered, they were destroyed, they were vanquished. Apparently their gods didn't help them at all. False gods, idols. So what is the temptation? That you see these ruined societies and you're going to ask yourself, how do these nations worship their gods? Let me do the same thing. Why would I be tempted to do the same thing? It didn't help them. Why should it help me? And the Torah goes on and says, don't do it. Don't worship this way. Because these nations, they brought their children. They brought their children as sacrifices to the gods. Abominable practices. So don't do it. Now the Ramban says a very, very elegant interpretation, certainly the pshat in the parasha. He says like this. Because we know when it comes to Avodah Zarah, when it comes to idolatry, there really are two forms of idolatry. There are two ways in which a person can be liable for the death penalty for idolatry. If you don't meet one of these two conditions, you're off on a technicality. One way is you worship that particular deity in the way that its worshippers worship it. Because every Avodah Zarah, every deity, every idol is worshipped in a certain way. You have to worship it in the way that its worshippers worship it. If you invent your own rituals or you borrow rituals from another getchka, for this getchka, you're not liable for the death penalty. I mean, it's not permitted, but you're off on a technicality. To be liable, it has to be that you worship the idol in the way that it's worshipped. And, of course, we don't have idols nowadays. But when they had idols, every different idol had to be very carefully studied and analyzed. How is it worshipped? What are the laws of its worship? So this way you would know whether a Jew who practices that form of idolatry would be liable. As I said, the Talmud says an amazing thing, that Avraham Avinu, his Maseches Avodah Zarah, his tractate of Avodah Zarah, had either 600 or 700 chapters, the Gemara says. Ours only has 5 chapters. Because by the time that our volume of the Talmud dealing with idolatry was written, idolatry wasn't in vogue anymore. So it wasn't necessary to inquire as to how all the various idols were worshipped. But in the time of Avraham Avinu, this was the heyday of Avodah Zarah. So therefore, the laws of Avodah Zarah required an analysis of every deity, how exactly it was worshipped, to know in what way a Jew would be liable. So the Gemara says, for example, that there were certain Avodah Zarahs that were worshipped in very outlandish ways. There was an Avodah Zarah called Markulis. there was worship by throwing rocks at it. That's what they worshipped, they threw rocks at it. And there was an Avodah Zarah called Peor that was worshipped by defecating in front of it. So the Gemara says, if you defecate to Peor and you throw rocks at Markulis, you're liable. But if you throw rocks at Peor and you defecate to Markulis, you're not liable, because you didn't worship the Avodah Zarah in the way that it was conventionally worshipped. That's one way. The other way is, if you take one of the rituals which is reserved for Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash, and you perform that ritual for a foreign deity, even though that deity is not normally worshipped that way, you also could be liable. Because if you've taken a ritual which is meant to be directed to the Ribono Shel Olam, and you've directed it to a false god, that also would be grounds for liability. The Gemara says there are four basic avodas, four basic forms of worship. There is slaughtering, sacrifices. There is the pouring of blood or wine on the altar. There is the burning of sacrifices and bowing. These are the four rituals which are generally directed to the Ribono Shel Olam in the Beis HaMikdash. You direct those to the Avodah Zarah, you're liable, even though that Avodah Zarah wasn't worshipped that way. But here it's a different crime. The crime is that you're taking something which is meant to be directed to God, and you are perverting it by directing it to another deity. These are the two forms of Avodah Zarah. Now comes the Torah and tells us an amazing thing. The Jews conquer Eretz Yisrael, and they vanquished nations which had religions. They had gods, and they worshipped these gods, and so on and so forth. They practiced rituals for the gods. Now, how are the Jews to understand? Why is it that these nations were conquered? What was their sin? So we would jump to the conclusion that their sin was terrible. They worshipped all these false gods. Avodah Zarah, terrible, terrible crime. But there's another possibility. The other possibility is that these beautiful rituals they performed, so magnificent, so profound, so beautiful. And these are rituals that would be properly directed to Hashem. And instead, these nations directed them to Avodah Zarah. That's why they were destroyed. In other words, it's a mistake, but it's a reasonable mistake. Perhaps that's why the nations were destroyed. Because they took these rituals, which are magnificent, beautifully profound rituals, and they misdirected them. Instead of directing them to the real God, they directed them to the Avodah Zarah, and that's why they were vanquished. So when the Jews come in, they say, there was nothing wrong with the rituals. The rituals themselves were beautiful. The problem is, they directed them to the wrong deity. But let me now inquire as to what these rituals were, and I will do the same thing, not to the Avodah Zarah. I will practice these same rituals for God. I'll practice the same rituals for God. That's what the Torah is talking about. Not that, let me see what they did and I will worship their gods. Let me study their rituals so that I can direct these same rituals to the true God. Because that's how the Jews would understand it. The mistake was that they thought that that's why the Gentiles were destroyed. Because they took these magnificent rituals and directed them to the wrong object. But we should study what they did and take those same rituals and direct them to the Ribono Shel Olam. So to that Hashem says, don't make that mistake. Don't do that to God. Meaning, don't take their rituals and direct them to God. Because what did they do? What were their rituals? They sacrificed their children. They burnt their children to gods. That's not a beautiful, meaningful ritual. It's abhorrent. It's murder. So don't take their rituals and direct them to the Ribono Shel Olam. That's not the point. It's not that the rituals are beautiful but misdirected. The rituals themselves are abhorrent. And therefore don't borrow those rituals and practice them for God. That's what the Ramban understands the parsha. Magnificent reading of the parsha. So let's see if you get the moral. So what is the moral of the story? Should Jews absorb what is to be absorbed from foreign cultures, or should they close the door shut? and let nothing foreign in.
I think we should close the door.
So who says close the door?
I do.
Maybe the camera should pan for the audience. So who votes to close the door? And who votes to open the door?
Open the door.
Because you know it's a trick question, right?
I said open the door.
You said open the door.
Listen very carefully. Listen very carefully.
It's a generalization.
Listen very carefully. What the Torah says is like this. The Torah is saying that before you let something in, you have to understand it. It's not a blanket prescription. Don't let anything in. But don't let anything in without understanding it very, very deeply. In other words, you have a ritual, and you're wondering, is this a ritual which is worth bringing into the Beis HaMikdash? So God says, don't do it. Why? Not because anything foreign is off limits. Foreign, no, we don't, nothing foreign. Everything has to be grassroots. Everything has to come from within. No, it doesn't say that. It says, don't absorb this ritual because this ritual is abhorrent. Because when you study, you'll see, what did they do? They sacrificed their children to the Eliezer. In other words, it's not a blanket prescription that it's always off limits. It says, you have to exercise caution. Before you borrow something, you have to see exactly what it is. You have to understand it deeply, right? See what its roots are. And then God says that when it comes to the ways in which the Gentiles worshipped their gods, you'll see that it's not just that it's directed to the wrong object, that actually there's something abhorrent with the rituals themselves. And we pointed this out many times, that the term that Chazal use for idol worship is called Avodah Zara, which is foreign worship. Not the worship of foreign beings, it's foreign worship. The ritual is foreign, the ritual is abhorrent. And this is what the Torah is telling us, that the rituals that the Gentiles directed towards their gods are by definition abhorrent. Now why are they by definition abhorrent? No, it's very, very simple why they're abhorrent. Because it all depends on your conception of the God. Because if you conceive of the God as a being which has needs, and the worship is a trade-off, in other words, I'm going to appease the God and therefore get something from the God, or as they say in fundraising, give it or get, give and get. So then, to serve God that way is abhorrent. So why did they slaughter their children to the God? In other words, they felt that somehow this would pacify the God, this would appease the God. The gods are angry, the gods want something, they enjoy our sacrifice, they enjoy seeing us grovel, whatever it is. And therefore they would sacrifice their children. If you have a proper conception of God, you would know that such a ritual is abhorrent. A God who is self-sufficient, who asks nothing from us, but that we should act morally, ethically, would not want that we should sacrifice human beings to him. And therefore, that's what the Torah is saying. Not that everything foreign is abhorrent. It's just that the rituals that we use to worship the gods, those have to be very carefully examined, because as a rule, the rituals which they developed, in as much as they are rooted in a incorrect conception of God, they will be abhorrent when you try to transplant them into a Beis HaMikdash, which is devoted to the worship of the true conception of God. Now, it happens to be that this issue was historically a great machlokas. It was a great machlokas. And I'm only giving you one side of the issue. I guess you could make a different case and read it differently. But, for example, when the Reform movement became active in Hungary in the mid-1800s, and in Germany in the early 1800s, there really were two different strategies as how to deal with the challenges. The Reform movement essentially borrowed many of its observances and practices from the church. For example, that the clergymen should wear clerical robes. And this was not something that was done in synagogues previously. But in the church, the priest who performed the service wore clerical robes. This lent dignity to the service. And therefore, the reformers thought this is a good idea. Let's introduce this in our synagogues, that the rabbi, the clergyman, should also be dressed in robes.
We had it in Beit HaMikdash.
Pardon?
We had this in Beit HaMikdash.
In the Beis HaMikdash we had it for the avoda, but in the Beis Knesset it never was that way before the Reform movement. So this is one introduction the Reformers added. They added something interesting, that the rabbi who performed the service, or the cantor who performed the service, would now face the audience. Now it's interesting that this, even in Christianity, was a late reform. In the Catholic Church, originally, until Vatican II, the priest celebrating the Mass would also stand facing the front with his back to the audience. But in Protestant churches, the celebrant of the Mass faced the audience, and in Vatican II, the Catholics embraced that also. But in the Beis Knesset, it's not that way. The Chazan stands with his face towards the Aron Kodesh and his back to the people. But the Reformers introduced that change. The Reformers introduced the organ. There should be music with the service. Again, in the Beis HaMikdash there was music. This was the basis of the innovation. But in the Beis Knesset there never was instrumental music, and the Reformers introduced that. And so on and so forth. Many, many changes. One of the interesting changes they introduced was decorum. That sounds funny. But, in a synagogue, things are very, very informal. And sadly, there's a little bit of talking, too. You may be aware of that. Here, talking. It happens. Sometimes. But this became very, very important in the Reform Temple. Pardon?
I said only doing Daven.
Very, 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 very important. Decorum, maintaining order, ushers, etc. So the question is, to certain groups of people, this became very attractive. They saw that the Reform services were much more dignified and much more solemn, and perhaps it was worth going. And needless to say, the early Reformers did not break with Jewish law in extreme ways. For example, when they introduced the organ in the temples in the early and mid-1800s, it wasn't a question, God forbid, that a Jew should play the organ on Shabbos. I mean, that wasn't the question. The question is that a Gentile should play the organ. The Jews certainly couldn't play the organ on Shabbos. That's prohibited. But could we permit a Gentile to do it? That was the question. It wasn't. Certainly there was no. Just to give you an example of an amazing, amazing thing. This is a tangent, but I think it'll give you a flavor of what the early Reformers were. When Rav Shamshon Fal Hirsch became the Rav of Frankfurt, so the Orthodox community seceded from the umbrella community, which had been taken over by the Reformers. And the Reformers had a kosher butcher store. And the secessionist Orthodox community had its own kosher butcher store. What was the difference between the two? In the Reform butcher store and the Orthodox butcher store, the Reform butcher store salted the meat for you. You didn't have to salt it at home. They salted it for you. And the Orthodox butcher store was the old-fashioned way that you bought the meat and you brought it home and you kashered it yourself. So it wasn't that it was treif. It wasn't that it was not slaughtered properly. It was even kashered for you. So you could take it home, it was ready to cook. And it was a convenience. So that's why it was very attractive. In other words, busy housewives preferred the Reform butcher store to the Orthodox butcher store as a matter of convenience. It wasn't that they were selling
That's how we hold today.
pork. And today, that's the way it's done. So Shamshon Fal Hirsch was the Rav of the secessionist Orthodox community of Frankfurt, was asked that why don't we introduce this into our butcher store, just as a matter of convenience, and this way our meat outfit will be viable. So he said, God forbid, he wrote in a written response, it's published, says, God forbid that my hand should be involved in this injustice to deprive the Jewish women of this great mitzvah of kashering the meat themselves. Because he wants nothing of it. That he should be complicit in stealing this mitzvah from the wonderful Jewish women. No, nothing doing. He doesn't want that. Amazing thing. That's what the reform was in those days. So the question is, how do you fight the reform? So Rav Shlomo Hirsch in Frankfurt had one strategy, and the great Chassam Sofer in Hungary had another strategy. The strategy of the Chassam Sofer in Hungary was, we don't allow anything foreign in the door. We do everything as it always was done. We don't make any changes. We dig in our heels, and this is how we practice. So even reforms that would have made sense in theory, but once the reformers are doing it, that's it. They've borrowed it from the church. We're not introducing it into the synagogue. So, for example, there was a movement that instead of the sermons being given in Yiddish, perhaps the sermons should be given in the vernacular, the language that the people spoke, because it was reaching the point that some people didn't even speak Yiddish anymore. So let them be given in Hungarian. So in the areas that were within the sphere of influence of the Chassam Sofer, they said, no, nothing doing. And they even had a maxim that Chadash Asur min Torah. Anything new is forbidden from the Torah. Now, that's a play on words. There is a prohibition called Chadash, that grain, newly harvested grain, is forbidden until the sacrifice of the Omer was brought. That's called Chadash. So Chadash is forbidden by the Torah, but the Chadash means new. So that was their maxim. Anything new is forbidden. We got to do it the old-fashioned way, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it was even bizarre. You know, if the old-fashioned way is informal and not solemn, we got to keep that too. And by the way, you see that nowadays. You see, you go into shuls that are fairly new shuls, and you see the seating is arranged in such a way to facilitate talking. You know, because that's how it was done. Like one of my favorite stories, they had a contest to find the best answer to the question, why?
Why not?
What's the best answer? So one answer, I think the winning answer was, why not? Another answer is because. But one of the runner-up answers is, because that's how it was done in Europe. So we gotta do it that way. But in any case, the Reb Shlomo Hirsch held no. But that's not the point. Every innovation has to be very carefully measured and weighed. What is its source? What is its objective? Is it consistent with halacha? Is it not consistent with halacha? If, after careful analysis, we determine that it's acceptable, then by all means we can bring it to the synagogue. If after careful analysis we determine that it's not acceptable, then we have to leave it outside. But there's no objection per se to something new and different. But you can't just let it in. It's not that everything which is new and improved is good. But you have to understand it. You have to know where it comes from. And therefore, Rav Shlomo Hirsch, for example, allowed the rabbis to wear clerical robes, and the sermons were conducted in German, not in Yiddish, but the organ wasn't let in, because he held that that's a breach of halacha, even if a non-Jew plays the organ. And therefore, that he forbade. And that's where he drew the line, and so on and so forth. So we're going to have two strategies. I'm just pointing out that I think that this parsha in the Torah, which tells us that the reason we don't embrace the foreign rituals is not because anything foreign by virtue of its being foreign is objectionable. But to the contrary, it's objectionable because it is intrinsically abhorrent, really points to the direction of Rav Hirsch. In other words, that you have to analyze it. When it comes to Avodah Zarah rituals, so the Torah is telling us there's almost a automatic presumption that it's abhorrent. Because if the ritual is designed to serve one conception of God, obviously it makes no sense when it comes to the worship of another conception of God. But there could be things of a foreign culture which are worth observing.
But in the case of the Beis Hamikdash, there's a tremendous amount of detail in how everything is supposed to be done. Page after page is devoted to the subject. So that even in the case of Nadav and Avihu, who were pious men, they chose to do something somewhat different, zealously, not because they didn't love God.
Again, when I say
within the Beis Hamikdash, it seems.
Let me just explain myself a little more clearly. When I say we're talking about absorbing something, I don't think that means we should absorb it and do it in the Beis Hamikdash. I think the Avodas Hashem of the Beis Hamikdash, right, could has to be done as the Torah says it.
It's very narrow.
Right. But I'm saying, but why not in your home, for example, or in your backyard?
Right.
Practice one of these things. I'll tell you a story. I mean, it's an embarrassing story. Not embarrassing to me, but I'll tell you a story that there was a yeshiva. I won't name the yeshiva. And the boys were a little wild. Fun-loving, as boys will be boys. And the mashgiach, the dean of men of this yeshiva, was a European. He was a very great tzaddik, but not very familiar with the culture at large. Not American culture, not even the European culture where he was from. And he was a person who spent many, many, many years in the yeshiva, in the Beis Medrash. He was kind of oblivious to what's going on outside. Anyway, it was December time, and the boys decided as a prank that they were going to bring a tree into the dorm, and they would decorate it with lights, and then they had it in the dormitory. Anyway, yeshiva boy that. So anyway, the mashgiach walks into this room and he sees this evergreen tree with lights on it. So he says, "What's das? Like, what is this?" He had no idea what it was. So they told him, "This is a Hanukkah boy. It's a Hanukkah tree." So he explained that he decorated the tree for Hanukkah. No, the Amerikanische Minhagim and these American customs. He says, "Okay, let it be. Just don't bring it into the Beis Medrash. Don't bring it into the shul. That be that." In the Beis Hamikdash, the Torah prescribes how the rituals are performed. So we're not going to change the avod of the Beis Hamikdash in light of what was done in a pagan temple. But the question is that why not practice these rituals on your own independently? So therefore, that's what the Torah says. Keep them out because there's a presumption of their being abhorrent. But in theory, there could be things that are worth observing. For example, if you go to Parshas Noach, we know we have the story of Noach and his 3 sons, and we know that Chum, one of the sons, humiliated his father. I can go into the details. And Shem and Yefes, the other 2 sons, they came and covered their father. And Shem was the one who took the initiative. Yefes followed along. So Noach cursed Chum, and he blessed Shem and Yefes. Shem got a very lovely blessing because he was the one who really was the prime mover here. But Yefes also got a blessing, and God said to him, "Yaft Elokim liYefes." God bestowed the gift of beauty on Yefes, v'yishton ba'olei Shem. But that beauty should dwell in the tents of Shem. Jews were not renowned for their aesthetic practices. Greece was the place of beauty. Yefes is the forerunner of Yavan, of Greece. And the Gemara says that the real beauty of Yefes, from among all his descendants, the real beauty resides in Greece. And God said that the beauty of Greece can find a place in the tents of shame. And from this, the Gemara learns a halacha that a Sefer Torah, believe it or not, can be written in Greek, either in Hebrew or in Greek, because the beauty of Yefes has a place in the tents of shame. But you have to know exactly what you're doing, how it can be absorbed, to what extent can it be absorbed. But there's nothing abhorrent to taking the best of a foreign culture and incorporating it, but you have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand what it is. So it may be that in a practical sense, you should always keep the door shut, because who has the time for that type of analysis? But in theory, there is a room for the aesthetics and the works of our neighbors to find a place even in Jewish life. You know, it's an interesting thing that every so often you hear of a chazan who will take a non-Jewish tune and will somehow put it into the service in a synagogue. And there'll be a mixture of reactions. And some will say, oh, very nice tune. Baruch Hashem, we conquered it for the sake of holiness. Some people will say, oh, it's a terrible thing. It's a foreign tune. It should be left out. And this is really the issue which revolves around. But sometimes, in other words, you see people take tunes and put them into the synagogue ritual, but the tune has no connection to the words. In other words, the words may be words that should be properly sung in a very, very plaintive, pleading way, and the tune is something which is really upbeat and rocky, and it doesn't fit the words. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the words are meant to be recited triumphantly, and the tune is in a minor key, which is very, very sad and pensive, and so on and so forth. Because what does that indicate? It indicates that the people that are doing the borrowing don't know anything about what they're borrowing from. But when you do that, then you're certainly making a mistake. In other words, that which the Torah is clearly saying, that when you borrow, you have to know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, then it probably makes more sense to be prudent, to be careful. So it's a very complex issue. And undoubtedly, the question of Hanukkah was a very, very subtle issue. We're not dealing with an issue that was black and white, Hanukkah. Where one side was right and one side was wrong. It might have developed that way. Because once the battlegrounds, battle is, the two armies are opposed, then they become polarized. But the initial conflict, the question of letting Hellenist culture in, was not a very simple issue at all. It probably was very, very subtle, very, very complex. And the arguments this way and this way were probably arguments that were very, very, very fine, and almost, to use an expression we say in the Siddur, dak al dak alei nivdak. They were so fine that they were even beyond discernment. You couldn't even fully grasp them. They were so fine. But that's the nature of all disputes. Because all disputes that have genuine significance start out as very, very subtle issues, and then as the controversy expands, then it becomes extreme in both directions. But initially, we're dealing with something which is very, very, very fine. In this week's parsha, we have a parsha, a story, which really relates to this entire question of assimilation, of becoming assimilated, which is the story of Dinah. The story of Dinah. Just to review the story in very, very simple terms, Yaakov Avinu has a daughter, the only daughter which is mentioned explicitly in the Chumash, named Dinah. And it says that Yaakov has returned to Eretz Yisrael, he's overcome Esav, and he's settling down in the city of Shechem. And it says, "Vateitze Dina bas Leah liros bivnos haaretz." The Dina, the daughter of Leah, went out to see what the women are doing. Now, in the simple explanation of the verse, it's very, very understood why she'd want to do that. Now, imagine if you were raised in a home with 12 brothers. You probably want to see what the local girls are doing. There was a little female companionship. So she went out to see what they were doing, what they were wearing, and what they're dancing, and so on and so forth. But there's always a danger that if you go out to see, there's danger of being seen. And she was abducted by a local prince named Shechem. It's also the name of the city, but that was the name of the prince. And the prince fell in love with her. And interestingly, wanted to marry her, which sounds so quaint by our modern moral standards. I mean, he raped her first, of course, but you know, after that, he says he wants to marry her. He wants to marry her. I mean, he could have kept her as a slave, but no, he wants to do it proper. Dot every I, cross every T. He wants to marry her. So he and his father come to negotiate with the family, with the Mechutanim. And needless to say, they are very, very, very upset, very distressed. It's a terrible thing that the daughter of Yaakov should meet such a fate. So the sons say the following. The sons say, listen, we have no objection. We'd be happy that we should become as one, our people and your people, and we will marry your daughters, you'll marry our daughters, it'll be wonderful. There's one problem. The problem is that in our culture, being uncircumcised is abhorrent. It's not acceptable. We can't intermarry with a group of people who remain uncircumcised. So I'll tell you what the deal is. That if all your townspeople agree to have bris milah, be circumcised, then it's a deal. And oddly enough, they go for it. And they go back to their city, and they gather all the townspeople and say, listen, we've met these people, they are fabulously wealthy and fabulously successful, and there can be a merger. There's one small catch, that we all have to be circumcised, but it's not a problem. And the whole people, the whole town agrees. And they get circumcised, and on the third day, everyone is in pain. It's the most painful day of the circumcision. And Reuven and Shimon come in, they massacre the entire city, and they retrieve Dinah. Yaakov is terribly upset about this, and they defend themselves. What was our choice? What could we do? And that's where the story ends. Very, very peculiar story. Now, just as an aside, I'll just mention that the Ramban asks a question. I mean, Yaakov was there when the brothers made this proposal. Like, what did he think? What did Yaakov think the plan was? I mean, wasn't this the plan initially? They should all get a bris, and the third day, when they're weak, they'll go in and kill everybody. So the Ramban says, no, that's not what Yaakov Avinu thought. And I tell you what the brothers thought. Yaakov thought the plan was like this. By making this outlandish suggestion, the likelihood is that we'll say, listen, we're not interested, and accordingly we'll give Dinah back. So, and the truth is, you think about it for a second, I mean, you tell an entire city that the deal is only on if everyone gets a bris, right? You would think that the likelihood is that they would say, no thank you, take your daughter back, and the deal's off. So that was what Yaakov Avinu thought. And if worse comes to worse, if by some strange quirk of fate they agree, so then on the third day that everyone is in pain, we can just walk in and retrieve Dinah, and no one will be able to stop us. They'll be helpless. And we'll take our daughter and we'll run off. So therefore, Yaakov Avinu had no inkling that this was the idea to slaughter the people, and the other brothers also didn't think of it. But Reuben and Shimon, they decided to slaughter to slaughter the city, and that's what happened. what is the issue over here? The Sfarim tell us that this was one of the greatest crises in the history of the Jewish people, because the suggestion that the brothers made in the hope that they wouldn't go for it, but they did, was a suggestion that would have led to the obliteration of the barrier between Jew and Gentile. Because you have this entire city, and they said, listen, we'll be circumcised, we'll become one, you'll marry ours, we'll marry yours, we'll do business together, we'll become like one nation. That would obliterate the barrier between Jew and Gentile. So it was a very great danger. In other words, it was a wonderful strategy if the plan would have worked. If they would have said, no, that's too much, too high a price to pay, here's your daughter back, then it would have worked. But once they agree to be circumcised, there's a very serious problem. The Jews are at risk of really disappearing as a people. And Shimon and Levi felt that under these circumstances, we have no choice but to defend ourselves. Now you might ask, what is the legal prerogative for them to defend themselves? And this is a question that the Mefarshim discussed, but the Maharal says an amazing insight here. The Maharal says it in a few short words, but let's explain a few, I think it's very important. We know that there's a right to self-defense, correct? But there is a distinction between the self-defense of an individual or the self-defense of a nation. Let's say, for example, someone comes to me and says, if you don't give me $1,000 or do what I say, I'm going to take this sledgehammer and smash your windshield. Right? That wouldn't justify my shooting him. Now, the right of self-defense of an individual is when he's threatened with death. But if the threat is he's going to smash in my windshield, then that doesn't justify killing him. But we know that the self-defense of a nation is different. In other words, let's say, for example, the United States would invade Canada and say, listen, we're taking over. We're sending 250,000 troops over the border. We're taking over Canada. If you don't protest, there'll be no killing, no bloodshed. But if you try to stop us, then we're going to let loose with all our military might. So what would you say? Does Canada have a right to defend itself? Why? No one's being threatened with death. But it's obvious that the self-defense of a state is different than the self-defense of an individual. The state has the right to defend its territorial integrity, to defend its system of government, to defend its culture, to defend its honor. And it's very different than the self-defense of an individual. An individual only has the right to defend his life. But a state, a nation, has the right to defend not only its life, but it can defend its values, its system of government, its territory, etc., even at the expense of lives. That's so obvious that it doesn't need any, I don't think it needs any proof. So the Maharal says that the Jewish people at this point had the prerogatives of a nation. They were a nation, a small nation, but they actually had the status of a nation. God conferred upon them the status of a nation, and all the prerogatives of a nation, including the right to wage war, to defend its honor, the Jewish people had. And this was a situation. Their sister was abducted. This was a crime against the honor of the Jewish people. That justified going to war, and the killing of the people of Shem, like Shimon and Levi, was not an act of murder, it was an act of war. That's what the Maharal says. An amazing thing. But, what I want to point out from the story is the following. How does the story start? She went out, liros b'vno saaretz, to see what the girls were doing. Now there's an amazing hint. The Chassam Sofer says, an amazing thing. There's a verse earlier in the parsha which says that when Yaakov was making the arrangements for his encounter with Esav, so it says, Vayivaser Yaakov levado, Yaakov was left alone, and he encountered an angel, who was the angel that symbolized Esav, and they had a battle. The entire night, Yaakov survived, but he was left limping, and so on and so forth. It says Yaakov was left alone, levado. So the Medrash says that this levado doesn't simply mean that he was alone. It really points to a special virtue of Yaakov Avinu, a godly virtue, because it says something about God. It says, "V'nizgav Hashem levado," that God alone will be exalted on the great day of Mashiach. So God is described as levado. Yaakov also had this virtue of levado. What is this great virtue of levado? The idea is like this: that, all too often in life, we are seeking the approval of others. Seeking the approval of others. We're not self-confident. We're not independent. If everyone is doing something, if everyone is eating something, everything is watching something, we feel we have to do the same. We're not comfortable standing on our own 2 feet, asserting ourselves. God, of course, doesn't have that problem. God is totally self-sufficient, totally independent. God doesn't look over his shoulder to anybody. That's v'nizgav Hashem levado. God alone is exalted. Yaakov also had that quality. Because Yaakov was self-validating. Yaakov didn't look over his shoulders to see what other people were saying, what the newspapers were saying, what the New York Times was writing about it. That's the virtue of levado. It's the godly virtue. The Chassam Sofer points out that Vateitze Dina bas Leah, those words, that Dina, the daughter of Leah, went out, if you take the first letters, Vateitze Dina bas Leah, Vav, Daled, Beis, Lamed, spell levado in reverse. It's the opposite of levado. But the Chassam Sofer doesn't say what the issue is. This points out, makes this amazing observation that it's levado in reverse. But I would like to say, time is short, so I'll say very fast, that we talk about the idea of being open to absorbing aspects of the culture that surrounds us. But there's one important thing we have to be careful about, which is that we are doing it only because we see that that element of culture has value, and only to the extent it has value. When we do it because we seek the approval of those who live around us, because we want to be respected by them, acknowledged by them, to be more highly regarded by them, then it's always danger. In other words, it has to be in our terms. It has to be levado. We are self-validating. We have minds of our own. We have values of our own. But we're not against good ideas. So if we see that our neighbors are doing something which makes sense, well, we can do that. In other words, let's say, for example, imagine if the Jews had not yet become aware of the umbrella. You have a Jewish society, no umbrellas. And they go out in the rain, they get wet. All of a sudden, there's a Gentile out there who has an umbrella, and the Jew says, wow, what a great idea. Imagine that. Says you carry this thing, and you walk in the street when it's raining, and you don't get wet. Says we should embrace this very, very strongly. So the Jew opens a factory to produce umbrellas, and before you know it, every Jew has an umbrella. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. In other words, I mean, there could be a different position. The Goyim, they use umbrellas. We don't wear umbrellas. We get wet. Right? And I would say that's foolish. You have to be open to the fact that our neighbors may have something which makes sense. It has to be carefully analyzed. It has to make sense. It has to serve a purpose. It has to have a function. If we determine that it has a valuable function and it's meaningful, if something objectionable to it, then we do it. But let's say, for example, in Green Bay, Wisconsin, it used to be, I don't know if it's the case anymore, that the Green Bay Packer fans used to wear hats that looked like wedges of cheese. So, and I'm a Jew in Green Bay, and I see, it's Sunday during the season. All my neighbors are wearing hats that look like wedges of cheese. And how are they going to look at me if I'm not wearing such a hat? Right? They're going to look at me like I'm a misfit. I'm not part of cultured society. I have to wear such a hat too. So that's a danger. In other words, we're not closing the door to things that are foreign, but when we're only doing it to ingratiate ourselves to our neighbors, then it's very, very dangerous ground. Because you have to be levado, you have to be independent, you have to be self-sufficient, you have to be self-validating, you have to use your judgment. When it's the point that you embrace it because you want to be part of what everyone else is doing, because you want to, etc., right? That's objectionable. That's vatete dina basle is levado in reverse. Right? I'll tell you a very interesting story, and we'll end with this. I was talking to a young man, a boy, who studies in the yeshiva in the States recently. And this boy is a very, very yeshivish, frum boy. And I was having a conversation with him. It was very interesting. And what will he allow in his home? What will he not allow in his home? So the boy tells me he's really a very open-minded person. Really? I'm happy to hear that. Tell me, how open-minded are you? Right? So he says, well, for example, if one of his kids wanted to collect baseball cards, for example, he'd have no objection.
Wow.
That's what he said. So I said, that's very enlightened. I said, let me ask you a question. Let's say one of your kids wanted to go to university. Right? What would you say then? So he was, that was like shaky. I said, I have to tell you that I look at things differently. I really do. If one of my children want to go to university, right, I would say, that has merit. There's educational things you could learn, and job skills, and vocational, and Chazal tell us, Chachma b'umas tameh, that there is wisdom among the nations. So I can understand that. I think that university campus is not necessarily a healthy place for a Jewish person. We have to make sure there are safeguards, etc. But I can understand that. So it says, if a child of mine wants to play baseball cards, I'd say, what for? Like, for what? Because that's what everyone else is doing. So that's not how a Jew should live. Right? A Jew shouldn't live in a way just because everyone else is doing it. You have to recognize, you have to, with judgment, with rational judgment, determine this is something which has value. I think that university education passes the test. I don't think baseball cards do pass the test. That's my feeling. And I don't see it as something which is harmless. I see it as something very dangerous. Because when you live your life in a way that I'm open to everything, why? Not because I see that it has value. I'm open to everything just because, like, this is what everyone else is doing, and I want to be a participant in that. That's a very dangerous way to live your life. So you might say, oh, baseball cards are trivial. It's true, it's trivial, but it speaks to something which is very, very serious. Which is an openness, which is just open simply because this is what everyone else is doing. How can I be left out? I want to be a part of that. That's not how a Jew lives. But if there's something which is genuinely valuable, that has genuine worth, then we have to consider it. We have to analyze it and consider the possibility of our embracing it. But the key is levado. The key is that we are self-validating, we are self-sufficient, we are independent, we have a mind of our own. And when it's the reverse, then it's vatete dina basleya, which is the opposite. Let me see what they're doing, and I can be a part of that. And then the whole thing snowballs, and then you reach a point where you may have no choice but to battle with Mesiras Nefesh, with sacrifice, to preserve your own integrity. It's a dangerous thing. And of course, that's the parallel to the Hanukkah story. That undoubtedly in the Hanukkah story, it reached that point, that it was necessary to fight with placing themselves at risk. But before it comes to that, we have to be our own gatekeepers. but it has to be in terms of our values and what we feel is important, right? On the one hand, we don't close the door. We don't say that there's nothing of value out there. Everything has to be banned. On the other hand, we don't do it just to be like everybody else. Because we analyze everything very carefully. And to do that, you have to understand it. Whereas if the person doesn't bother to learn about it, doesn't bother to inquire, he just says, that's, it's foreign, it's meaningless, it's worthless, it's goyish, what do we need it for? It's also a mistake. There may be something of very great value that the person is discarding. But it has to be a judgment. It has to be a reasoned judgment rooted in our values with an independent mind. And then, as Hashem, with God's help, we can make sure that we don't introduce anything which is too dangerous.